So my name's Rosemary Baird. I finished a history PhD in early 2012, and it was on Kiwi migrants to Australia, and that's what I'm talking on tonight. What I've ended up becoming once I finished my thesis is an oral historian, and this is really my passion. I love people's stories and social history. As I mentioned before, I'm not sort of fully employed by the university. I do a number of different projects, and I have a lot of sort of interests and projects going at the moment. So I do some heritage research for the City Council on historic buildings. Last year and a little bit this year I've worked for the National Council of Women's Voices project, which is up on Seismic, which I encourage you to go and have a look at. That's a wonderful project about women's stories from the earthquakes. I'm currently working on a project for the Ministry for Culture and Heritage called Remembering Christchurch, which is oral histories of elderly Christchurch residents and their memories of the city, the different suburbs. And I also have a project which is on the back burner at the moment on the construction of the Manapori hydro scheme. So I'm doing interviews with people who worked in that. So I have lots of interests, and I'm not actually working in this area at the moment, but I'm still always very interested in seeing what's going on. I'm from Christchurch. I was born here, I've studied here, and I live here, and I've never actually moved or lived in Australia. So. So the format for this evening is I'm going to talk for an hour, hopefully. I'll take my watch off just to make sure I don't go over time. And then there's time for questions as well. So I'll just, I've got a clicker here. Okay, here we are. This painting was actually done by one of the ladies I interviewed, and I love it. It's so evocative because it's got the Air New Zealand planes, and then it's got a Qantas plane in the background. And you'll hear more about her story later on. So I'm just going to start by talking today about actually my sister, because the people I studied in my thesis, they moved to New Zealand. They moved from New Zealand to Australia from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, and so sometimes I feel like my conclusions perhaps don't seem that relevant. But while I was finishing my thesis, my sister and her husband decided that they were going to move to Australia. So I was quite excited about this because I thought I could watch them and see, would my conclusions be borne out, and what was it like when it was someone who was actually close to me. So this is Michelle and Ben. That's at their engagement party in Te Anau, where Ben's from. Michelle's from Christchurch like me. And Michelle had just finished her physio degree. And I was very pleased to see that she got a job before she went to Australia. So she got a good job in a private hospital. Ben, who has an energy management degree, decided that he was going to try and get work in Western Australia in the mines, or maybe Queensland. And he thought he had a few contacts over there. So these aspirations down the side, these are not all their aspirations, but people often ask me, why do people move? What did you find out? And really, my conclusions are there's a whole range of reasons that people move, and it's not just financial. It's often to do with relationships, with aspirations. For Michelle and Ben, I'm sure part of it was, they were newly married. It's about being independent, setting up their life, getting some really good work experience. I think Michelle wanted to pay off her student loan. So there was a whole lot of reasons. I don't think escape was one of them, but that is for quite a few people. They've had a messy breakup, or they don't get on with perhaps their parents. So yeah, there's a whole lot of reasons. But I'm not talking about that in detail tonight. But if you want to ask me any questions about that, that's great. So just a little bit of background to, I guess, the project I did. I focused on Kiwis who moved from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, and I chose this period partly because obviously people are still alive. I can't talk to people who moved over in the 19th century, say. But as you can see from this graph, the late 1960s is really when the trend started to increase. And it's quite interesting, actually. There's sort of cyclical peaks every 10 years. And so within the period I looked at, there was 3 or 4 big peaks of when a lot of Kiwis moved to Australia. And it's continued. It's just stayed high, and we don't receive the same number of migrants from Australia. So for my thesis, I advertised around Australia and New Zealand in local newspapers, radios, word of mouth. I was just trying to find anyone who would want to share their story about having moved to Australia, and I was really thrilled. I got lots and lots of responses, And then about 270 of those people filled out surveys for me and wrote me their stories. And then from this group of people, I tried to pick a representative group who I would then go and do a oral history interview with. And so I ended up interviewing 36 people. Yes, it wasn't truly random, but I tried to be representative in terms of the date they moved, demographics, so their ethnicity, their gender, their job, the place they'd moved to. And I also interviewed Kiwis who'd moved to Australia and then moved back, so I did return migrants as well. Some of these interviews were quite long, sort of 3.5 hours. Some of them were just an hour. I tried to do a life history interview, not a true, really full in-depth life history interview, but enough to give a really good context of why they decided to move and their ongoing experience. And I'm going to introduce you to some of those stories this evening. I've got the people talking in my PowerPoint, hopefully, so that will hopefully give you a taste of what they talked about. So tonight I'm going to look at 4 common assumptions that, you can correct me if you think that I'm wrong about these, but I think in New Zealand we generally think that Australia is culturally similar to New Zealand, that we're not going to have problems moving over there, we'll fit in easily. The second thing is that Australia is close to New Zealand. There's no problem staying in touch, you can always just flick across the ditch. The third is that it's easy to return home to New Zealand, so close, quite cheap. If it doesn't work out in Australia, you can always return home. And the fourth is that success is more likely in Australia than New Zealand. Now, although I certainly came across lots of stories which did agree with these, I also came across lots of stories which complicated these stereotypes. And so I'm going to counter these 4 assumptions with some findings that I found from my interviewees. So first one is initial cultural dislocation, and then the second, missing family. The third is that things change in New Zealand, you change, so it's not as easy to return as you might think. And telling stories, I'll explain that more later. Okay. So the first is cultural dislocation, and I'll give you, sorry, they're a bit rude, but it's quite hard to find sheep jokes that aren't. There were much worse ones. I think what Kiwis need to realise when we move to Australia is that you will be recognisably Kiwi. People will pick you out as a New Zealander. And I had this experience myself. I remember one time I was over in Perth and I was catching a bus to someone's house, and the bus driver said to me, "Oh, turn out the light before you left." I didn't quite click. I was like, "What?" And then I realised it was a Kiwi joke, and I was like, "Oh!" I was really excited because I was experiencing firsthand. But I don't think he thought it was a bit of a weird response. But yes, heaps of people talk to me about the fact that they'd just be inundated with these Kiwi jokes. They would be teased about their accent and just be given a hard time generally. And people's response to this really just depended on their personality, and also the situation it occurred in. So some people loved being teased and would just give it back as much as they got. Other people found it really difficult, and in fact, I even came across 1 or 2 people who returned because they just hated it so much. I had one person that I talked to who, when he moved to Australia, he worked as in a boarding school, I think, as sort of a housemaster, and the students just gave him a hard time constantly. And I think because they were kids, he just got so sick of it, he ended up sort of ramming one of them against the wall. And but he didn't mind adults doing it, but it was just these boys. So I'm going to play you a clip now about accent. This is Jennifer, and I interviewed her in Canberra, but when she moved, she and her husband actually moved to Adelaide first. Bob was going to do a PhD in geology, and Jennifer worked as a computer programmer. She was a computer programmer from even early on. She was very smart and good with maths. And let's just, yeah. So I'll just play you her clip about her experience with her accent.
I take my work seriously, and I'd be explaining something to someone, and they would pick up on a bit of my accent, and that would really piss me off, because it's not about how you say something, it's the content of what you're saying. And so when I was in Adelaide, I consciously worked to change my accent, because I didn't want it getting in the way of what I was trying to say.
So, I mean, that wasn't everyone. Some people still had very strong Kiwi accents. I talked to one man who still had a really Southland burr after 50 years in Australia. But there were a number of people who just got so frustrated at being picked on that they deliberately changed their vowel sounds. Another way in that Kiwis could find themselves sort of not being picked on, but they were quite surprised, is actually some Kiwis, when they were looking for work, found that they wouldn't be given jobs because they were seen as Kiwis who were just over for 2 years, and then they'd leave and take, I guess, their experience with them. Or, you know, we want to keep the job for Australians. I should actually mention, though, that the study on Maori in Australia have found that some of them felt that they're less discriminated in finding work in Australia. They're seen as a Kiwi, not a Maori. So it goes both ways. Okay, so that's one aspect of cultural dislocation. The second is that Australia is just a different country. And this is Matt Clements and Julie Podstolski. He's an engineer and she's an artist, and they actually both went to Canterbury University and got married and then moved over to Australia. And they were I actually interviewed both of them at the same time, which was, I don't normally do, but it was a really great experience because they were both very articulate and had different sort of viewpoints. But it's nice because they've both got, the clips will show different reactions to the newness of Australia. So in one way, a lot of Kiwis moved to the big cities, so Melbourne and Sydney, and that's a new environment. I mean, a lot of people talked about just being like a rat race, so many people everywhere, the big bright lights of the city, the rush of the traffic. And so I'm going to play Matt's story, which is very much about learning to operate in this new city environment.
I mean, in Christchurch, I never drove. I had my licence, but I didn't have a car and hardly ever drove a car. And I wasn't driving, didn't have a car in Australia for quite a while. So I do remember my first year working. I was working right in the middle of the city for an engineering company, a construction company. And the boss wanted me to drop some tender documents on the other side of Sydney Harbour, so I had to cross the Harbour Bridge. He gave me the keys to his car, which was a big V8 Commodore. And you're talking about someone who had had their licence for about 18 months, but had actually only driven a car about twice in their life. But in Christchurch and never in Sydney, and I had to go across probably the busiest thoroughfare in Australasia, and but just getting out of the garage in this thing was a bit of a test for me, and then I got onto the Harbour Bridge, and I can remember I was gripping the wheel so hard that the sweat was just pouring off me. I was so nervous, and the lane seemed so narrow, and the cars were going all 80 kilometres an hour. But I safely navigated my way across, and I was so relieved to get across the other side. I didn't pay too much attention to what lane I was in. And I got in the lane that goes back, does a U-turn, goes back over the Harbour Bridge the other way. And navigating your way, once you get off the Harbour Bridge on the other side, it's no easy thing to get back again. You've got to go through a lot of, and I didn't know my way around. The trip, which should have taken about 45 minutes, took me about 3 hours. And I arrived back at the office, I think, just near closing time. Complete mess. I was just absolutely, distressed and tired and overwhelmed by the whole experience, totally drained, And one of my immediate boss said to me, where the hell have you been, And I told them the story about going across the harbour. I had to pay 3 tolls, I think, on the way, 20 cents each time, and they thought it was the biggest joke of all time. I thought it was really, I remember them roaring with laughter at the story, but it was very, very stressful.
And I actually came across quite a few men who had these almost like initiation stories about driving around the city and getting lost, and almost a way of sort of finding out where you were. And the cities Auckland's pretty big, but especially back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people just hadn't seen anything like moving to these big metropoles. Now I've got Julie as an example of another type of cultural dislocation with the environment. It's really interesting because she's an artist, so she's very sort of aware of landscape. And this wasn't just her. A lot of people I talked to found the Australian environment very different and often quite challenging. So we have this image that, yes, Australia is warmer than here, and that's true, but especially people who were living out in WA or on mining sites, or even in Queensland, it was so hot, it was so dry, the landscape was so different. And some Kiwis actually grew to really love the Australian landscape and to develop a real fondness for it, but other people just took years to get used to it. So I'll play you Julie's clip because she talks about this.
when we moved over here, I was homesick again. So in 1997, we moved to Western Australia, and I can remember we moved to East Fremantle, and we bought a house over in East Fremantle, which isn't far from here. And I can remember again giving Matt a really hard time. Why can't we live in New Zealand? Now I'm even further from there, you know. So I've had great wads in my life where I've just wanted to live in New Zealand. And I often used to have these dreams where I was in Australia, but I could just look over and there was Karori, you know, I could actually see it. I missed it so much. But then, without me realising it, I just started to feel like this really was home. So now I feel that this is home. And when I'm in New Zealand, I love visiting New Zealand, but I can't wait to get back. Yeah.
So let's just explore that a little bit more. Was there anything that sparked your homesickness, and were there specific things apart from your family that you were homesick for?
Yes, that's a good question. Because I'm an artist, I really take note of my surroundings, and what I find beautiful are the physical characteristics of New Zealand. So, for instance, the hills of Wellington, the hills and the harbour, the sea, the mountains of the South Island, the cold, clear light. So many of those things. And I used to, all my art was landscapes in the past. So, and to me, I just didn't find Australia beautiful. For a start in Sydney, I mean, Sydney's got some beautiful areas, but everything's built up. And I really missed the areas without houses on them or without buildings. And even when we lived in Coogee, I used to go down to the beach and I used to think, why aren't I happy here? This is the beach. You know, I live right by the beach, and here I am on the beach. And it took me a while to realise, because everything around this beach is buildings, nothing but buildings. And so for a while I actually used to travel back to New Zealand on what I called photography trips. And I'd go and take millions of photos and then come back and paint them. And in that way, I could be transporting myself to New Zealand. So, yes, it wasn't just the people. It was very... I actually felt like... I used to say this to Matt. I feel like I'm having an affair with New Zealand. Like, it's New Zealand that I love, but I'm stuck here in Australia, but I just want to be in New Zealand. But that got overtaken by Japan. Now it's Japan that I travel to and take photographs of and come back and draw and paint. So.
What was the significance of
when we moved over here? When we moved over here.
The next one. Sorry. Yeah. So I felt like there was a good exploration of just the homesickness for New Zealand's physical landscape, and lots of people talked about that. They talk about the ferns and the water and the green, and flying in and seeing the green when they arrived. One lady talked about sort of going home to New Zealand to be re-earthed. That was her phrase. So another way that Kiwis had to fit in was to sort of find their own networks in Australia. So unless you were a very lucky individual who moved over and had a whole sort of family and group of people, close friends that you had there, it would take time to make good friends and to hook into Australian networks. I've got a picture here from Cerise, who she was actually about my age, which was really cool. Most of the people I talked to were older, and she'd moved over when she was just 4, but her mum took her and her siblings to a Maori culture group in Perth, and that was really important for her and sort of staying connected to her identity when she pretty much grew up just as an Australian. But these groups, there's not heaps of them, and they are quite under-resourced, but they're sort of an anomaly. Like in terms of Pākehā Kiwis, there's not really strong networks. I mean, there's internet stuff, but it's not like there's strong national groups that Kiwis can hook into, so it really is about developing Australian networks. And some people had no problems with this, but others found it difficult. And so I've got a clip here from Daphne. Now, when you see a wee asterisk, that's not their real name because they've wanted it to be kept anonymous. So this is her talking about fitting into Melbourne.
Alone every day and having to find, I had all his friends, he's got a load of friends, but I had to tap into them. And I had to to start almost over. And I thought that was really good to start with, but it's actually harder in reality. It's well, you try and see it as a challenge, but it's really tough. Like, looking back, I think it was a pretty big thing to do, and I probably went in more naively than I thought. You know, you come over and you think, oh, this would be nice. Get a nice house. Well, no, you've got to get a job here. Real estate's $1 zillion. Like, it's tough. You've got to work it differently. And I wasn't expecting any of that, I think. Yeah. I sort of thought it might be a bit more like it was in New Zealand straight away, and people would pop in like they do in Kiwi land and say hi, and it wasn't like that. I find it a lot more formal and organised, and because it's bigger and people don't want to travel 50 minutes to pop in, you have to work it out. And yeah, I wasn't used to that at all. I found that a real challenge. And his friends were lovely, really nice. But again, they weren't part of my culture and they didn't know me, and I always felt like I had to start over, and it was quite tiring. When you think about that, every time you have to meet someone, it's harder. Whereas when I meet a Kiwi, I instantly feel something there that you don't have to explain. You just you link in and you're off. Whereas with Aussies, I feel like, I've got to start over and explain that where I'm from. I don't feel that quite so much now, but the relationships are, they're different. Yeah, really different. Yeah, you have to work on them quite a lot. And I found that very tiring. Very, very tiring.
So I think the thing to say is that these difficulties, they often only last for a year or two. They're probably the easiest challenge to overcome. You can change your accent, you can get used to a new environment, you can learn to love Australia. A lot of Kiwis marry Australians, so they'll fit into family groups and make good Australian friends. The reality is Kiwis do actually have it easy in Australia compared to other migrants groups. But just the thing is, it might be a little bit harder than you expect. It's not nothing. So I'm going to move on to the next area now, which is family ties. So this is another, I think, perhaps unexpected difficulty about moving to Australia. And the point about these difficulties is that some people are homesick initially for their family, but a lot of people don't actually feel homesick at first. And it's only when specific things happen that then they really miss their family in New Zealand. So one time, obviously, is, say, when people go through a really hard personal crisis. So Alexander here went through a very messy and unhappy divorce, and he'd never missed his family until then, and then suddenly 10, 15 years after he'd moved to Australia, he really missed his parents. Sorry, just trying to...
I will say that I missed my family terribly when I went through my terrible crisis. And if mum and dad were, I've often lamented that I don't have mum and dad living close at a time when I need them. But
And were you in closer contact during that time?
oh, absolutely, and still are. I used to ring them every month or so. I'll ring them every week now. Mum came over for 2.5 weeks, and then they both came back in January when we had our, we had a big family holiday planned anyway. So I don't have the benefits of extended family, basically, and I think that's fine if everything else is smooth, but there are times when you need your family.
Another time I found that Kiwis really missed their family was when they had their first children, and this was particularly women, because they were often staying at home with their baby, and especially if they hadn't got really good networks in Australia, they'd end up feeling quite isolated, and possibly even it might contribute to some postnatal depression. And so I've got another clip here from Jennifer, who we heard from before, and she is a very outgoing, friendly, active lady who worked and did really well, but when she had her children, suddenly she found that she missed her mum.
It always struck me it was slightly sad that my parents and Bob's parents were missing out on the kids on a day-to-day basis, even although ours are in Sydney, we don't see them. And also you have absolutely no support. And remember, I'm a person who, we've been both, apart from 2 years in Canberra, I have worked my entire life. And even although, you know, I would use childcare, there are times when you could use a mum or a mother-in-law help, you know. Also, you haven't got them when you have new babies to ask them questions. So there's a whole support group there that is missing. And when I saw my mother, I would talk to her about, you know, things like that and what have you. But you're using letters. You can't get instant results. So that made me very aware that, in fact, you know, and you'd have Australian friends who'd say, I can't bear my mother-in-law. She wants the kids, and you think, oh God, you know, in your dreams. It's really interesting. It gives you a different perspective on it.
So another thing about keeping in touch was that your family in New Zealand, no matter how hard you tried to keep in touch, no matter how often you visited, they go on their own lives, they change, especially children grow up, and it's hard to get back for everything. I mean, a lot of the people I talked to, they made huge efforts. So, you know, they'd save up and make sure their kids and their family would go back every year so they could meet their cousins, but it's still only once a year, and there'd be funerals or birthdays or anniversaries that they couldn't get to everything. So this here is Mildred, and she's Samoan, and she came from a very big, close family. She was actually very interesting. She moved over to Australia to go to a Seventh-day Adventist university because her family was Seventh-day Adventist. So she did actually have a lot of sort of church networks she could fit into over there. But here in this quote, she talks about going back to New Zealand and finding how the family's doing.
It's the other sister and the brother that are in New Zealand that you feel distant from, and the cousins and the aunts. Yeah, that's mostly it. And change is inevitable too, so when you see them, the kids are invariably taller. Or, you know, just boyfriends, and you have suddenly got boyfriends or girlfriends. You suddenly realise, my goodness, how old am I again?
The other thing I found, which I perhaps hadn't thought about, was that a lot of Kiwi migrants, it was 30 or 40 years on after they moved, suddenly they were faced with the issue of their ageing parents back in New Zealand, and their parents might be ill or very sick, close to death, and suddenly they were in another country and they had to decide what to do. And some Kiwis went to really extreme lengths. I talked to one lady and she used to fly back every 6 weeks to clean out her parents' fridge. But you still just couldn't be there the whole time. And sometimes these families, there'd be several siblings over in Australia, around the world, so there was no one back in New Zealand. And it was just a real dilemma, you know, these feelings of guilt. What do we do? You know, and if they weren't there when the parent died, that was a very heartbreaking situation. I talked to one lady and I had to actually turn off the recorder and erase that section because she was so emotional about talking about missing her mother's death soon after she moved to Australia. Some people actually brought their parents over to Australia to live with them. So I've got a picture here of Suzanne Belladonna, who married a Italian Australian in Perth, and they brought her dad to actually come and live with them after his wife died. And she had lots of lovely stories about the dad living with them and sewing frocks for her daughter's ballet recitals and helping out. But it was still a really big commitment to have him living with them for 12 years. Of course, I should point out that these issues are common to migrants the world over, and Kiwis are actually really lucky in that we can afford to, return home to New Zealand pretty regularly. We also receive, if we're in Australia, Kiwis will receive lots of visits from New Zealanders, but still you can't get back to New Zealand for everything. And in a way, I think because there's a closer distance, there can actually be a sense of guilt. Like, well, if you're, Australia and Britain, you can say, well, I just can't go over. It's too expensive. It's impossible. But when it's just across the Tasman, you think, oh, well, could I this time? Maybe I should, but and your family might expect you to come more. So there can actually be some tensions there with family in New Zealand expecting the Australian or the Kiwis in Australia to come over a lot more than they do, or that they feel is reasonable. So the third thing I'm going to talk about is returning to New Zealand. And heaps of people I talked to returned to New Zealand at some point. I was actually amazed at how many Kiwis moved to Australia and then came back to New Zealand, perhaps intending to stay in New Zealand, and then changed their minds and returned to Australia, or even did that several times. And I think part of the reason people came back to New Zealand and then returned to Australia was that returning was harder than they thought. They thought everything would just be the same. They'd just come home, they'd fit back in, but it wasn't always like that. So this is Diana Harlow, and she moved back to New Zealand because she'd divorced her Australian husband, and his family were butting in all the time and wanting the daughter and her daughter, the granddaughter, to spend time with them, and she just got so sick of them that she just left for New Zealand without telling them. But when she got to New Zealand, she really wasn't happy, and she says here, she was surprised at people's response as well. People called her a traitor and thought she was back for good, but she was like, no, it's a terrible mistake, I want to go back. And she did return to Melbourne once her daughter had grown up. They both returned. I talked to quite a few people, and I had stories as well from people who returned and said my family had moved on, or people had changed, or they realised I've changed, I'm not the same person as before I went, and I don't quite fit into New Zealand culture. It was interesting, there were even things like people who'd been gone for, say, 10 or 15 years, they came back and found that protocol around Maori and the place they played in the workplace, say, was different, and so it's not very PC, but people got really fed up with that and said, it's too PC, if my job will be given to a Maori over me, and so then they returned to Australia, and it's just things had moved on without them, and they hadn't kept up with changes in society. Other things that people found, that it could be a financial strain moving back here. They might not get a job earning as much money. A lot of people just missed Australia, missed the warm weather, the lifestyle, the friends they'd made, and often their children would miss Australia. So if their children had been born over there and they came back to New Zealand, well, they weren't really New Zealanders, they missed Australia. And so, as I said before, many would come back to New Zealand and then return to Australia. And something I want to talk a little bit about is that I think when there's children involved, there's just always more risk and potential for things to get a little bit more complicated. And people were often aware of this, but they wanted to move back anyway. And so sometimes you'd get people who moved with a family to Australia, their children grew up in Australia, they wanted to return to New Zealand, but by this time their children were teenagers or young adults and wanted to stay in Australia, and then you get a split family between New Zealand and Australia, and that could just be absolutely heartbreaking. You might end up with 2 of your kids in New Zealand, 2 in Australia. You feel at home in both places, but where do you choose to live? And so in some cases people would flick back and forth. And so I'm going to read you a story now, which is, it's a much fuller story, so I'm going to try and give a story of someone's long-term migration experience. I don't have a photo of her, so you'll just have to imagine. Okay, she's called Anne. Anne originally moved to Australia when she was 21 in about 1963. She'd just finished her nursing training and was tired and stressed out after her final exams. At the same time, some of her girlfriends in Sydney rang her and said if she'd come and make a fourth in their flat. Anne went to her nursing matron and asked for leave. But the matron was very unsympathetic, and this was a sliding door moment for Anne. She just told me off and looked at me with fierce eyes, and I got all bolshy and left, and I went to Sydney. In her first year in Sydney, Anne became engaged to Robin, a 10-pound POM migrant to Australia. Robin and his brother found work mining at Mount Isa in outback Queensland. Meanwhile, Anne returned to live with her parents in New Zealand while she prepared for the wedding. Robin and Anne then lived in New Zealand for a year after they married, but Robin didn't like New Zealand, so then they migrated back to England. The couple spent a year in England, but Anne was really homesick, so then they returned to New Zealand. After a few months in Timaru, they then moved to Auckland, and they had 9 years there, where they bought a house and had 2 sons. However, Robin was never happy in New Zealand, which he described as a rotten little country. After talking about returning to Australia for several years, One day Robin announced that they were moving to Perth. Anne was not happy. She loved the Auckland home and her circle of good friends. Just as they were about to buy the tickets, Anne put her foot down. I suddenly said, I'm not going all the way to Perth, it's too far away. So the family moved to Sydney instead. In spite of her reservations, Anne enjoyed Sydney's climate and lifestyle. Unfortunately, her marriage crumbled and the couple separated. Anne got a job at an advertising agency in Sydney, and there she met her new partner, Bert, a migrant from the Netherlands. Bert and Anne moved in together, but their relationship was initially pretty volatile. Anne's 2 sons were living with her ex-husband, and Bert's 4 children were living with his ex-wife. Both of them were plagued with guilt, and they fought a lot. In 1986, Bert and Anne decided that they should try moving back to New Zealand. Anne said, the reason we came back here was mostly because I wasn't really seeing much of my parents and the brother and everyone. They all lived here, and I said, oh, it'd be nice to have family. And her partner said, why don't we just go over and live in Christchurch? Then we can see your family, and I can get away from her, his ex-wife. So that was the reason why we came back. Not for any economic reason, because he didn't have a job to come back to. By this stage, Anne's 2 sons were living with her again. Neither of them wanted to return to New Zealand, and Anne had to bribe them with the promise of a motorbike to come. Back in New Zealand, the couple struggled. Finances were a big problem. Although Anne found work quickly, Bert, who worked in insurance, moved from job to job with little success. Anne and the boys found the Christchurch winter freezing. But after a few years, life settled down. The family enjoyed taking short trips to Kaikoura, the west coast, Akaroa. But in 1989, calamity struck. Bert received a phone call from Australia saying that his ex-wife was dying of cancer. So Anne agreed that she and Bert would take on Bert's 3 youngest daughters. The eldest one stayed in Australia. So Bert flew to Australia and returned with the girls after their mother's death. A week later, Bert lost his job. Anne described the ensuing stress. So they came back. That was 5 children in the house. I was working full-time. The first week they came, his company said, oh, we're folding up, sorry, you're out of a job. So here he is, head in hands. He's in a terrible state. Really, he was much worse than me. I said, come on, we'll get through. He did get a job, but it wasn't for about a month later. So we had to go to the bank and say, could we just put a stop on the mortgage payments? And they were good. They said, yeah, you can have 3 months off that. Bert was saying, I don't know what to do. I haven't got a job and we've got all these kids. He was pretty upset, pretty crabby with them all. And they were all crying because their mother had died and they'd come over with, we didn't have much when they came. We had to find the money to buy them beds and bikes and put them in new schools, and we didn't have the money. It was a hard time financially. Some family friends offered to look after 2 of the girls for a time, and eventually the situation became more stable. In a few years, however, the family situation was once again creating stress. Bert's eldest daughter ran away with an unsuitable boyfriend. Anne asked her grown sons to move out of home as they were using drugs and alcohol, having parties and generally going off the rails. In addition, the cold weather, in particular Christchurch's big snow of 1992, grated on Anne's nerves. Bert still felt he was earning not enough money. So in 1994, Anne, Bert and Bert's youngest daughter migrated back to Sydney. Once again, Anne was quite happy in Sydney. Both she and Bert had good jobs. The youngest daughter was finished high school and completing a nursing degree. Anne's 2 sons, meanwhile, had also followed them to Sydney. They'd lived in Sydney for 8 years when Bert began to worry about their mortgage. This is what Anne said. We had a mortgage, a $300,000 mortgage, which is nothing really in Sydney. But my husband moaned and groaned about this mortgage. He said, oh, you know, we're getting old, we shouldn't have this mortgage. I said, well, we don't really need to live in a 4-bedroom house with a swimming pool. We could move to our townhouse or something cheaper. But he said, oh, yes, I like having a swimming pool and it's nice to have space and I don't really want to move myself. He started this subtle business. Now, if we went back to Christchurch, you could see more of your mother. Bert's persuasions finally took root, and in 2002, Bert and Anne moved back to Christchurch. They bought a mortgage-free house and rental property. Bert's youngest daughter decided to travel, after which she stayed in Sydney. Anne's younger son, who was now married, also remained in Australia. Anne's eldest son followed them back to Christchurch. Anne enjoyed spending more time with Bert's eldest daughter and her children, who had remained in Christchurch. However, a few years later, this daughter moved to Perth with her children. Now, all of Anne and Bert's children and grandchildren, with the exception of one son, who was quite dependent on them, live in Australia. Anne and Bert really enjoy their life in Christchurch. When I talked to them, they were still here. But Anne was quite shocked when Bert announced that he was thinking of retiring. She realised that the loss of his income would limit their future options. Moving back to Australia might be unaffordable. She described herself as torn. She really wanted to live near her children and grandchildren in Australia, but she knew it might not be financially viable. Even at the time of our interview, she had no solution to her dilemma. Towards the end of the interview, she reflected on the effect of all her moves. She said, "It's been a big part of my life, flitting backwards and forwards. I mean, going backwards and forwards to Australia has been part of my life since I was 21 and I'm now 67. So it's been quite a big thing, and adjusting and readjusting all the time." And then I asked, "What do you think the process has done to you, all that readjusting?" And she said, "Probably screwed me up. It makes me discontented sometimes." And I said, "Why do you think that is?" She said, "Because I'm probably the sort of person that always thinks the grass is greener on the other side. Not so much nowadays. Now I've got more to do and I'm more involved with things. When I didn't have very much to do, I kept thinking about what might have been all the time." So obviously this is quite an extreme story. That's unusual that someone would make that many moves, but I actually did come across quite a few families where there'd be 2 or 3 moves, and then once the children stayed in Australia or New Zealand, it became more difficult about deciding where to stay. It was actually interesting. Anne reflected that even though often the motivation was partly financial, by moving so often it had been very detrimental to their personal wealth because they'd been moving households so many times. So I'm just going to move on to the last thing now, which is the question of, do you need to move to Australia to make a success? And I'm not really going to talk about this, but this just struck me when I was thinking about this talk. Traditionally, if you look at the history of New Zealand artists and I suppose even businessmen, writers, it's always been seen that you move to Australia or then London to make it big. You can't really make it big in New Zealand. And just recently, these are, you probably recognise them, this is Kimbra on the left, who is a New Zealand singer, but she moved to Melbourne when she was quite young and made her success from Melbourne. But then recently, you've had the even greater success of young 16-year-old Lorde, who has got #1 hit in the US chart, and she's done that from New Zealand. So I just think that's a good illustration of how you don't necessarily have to move to Australia to make a big success. So I called this Telling Stories for a number of reasons. First of all, I think the media, when we talk about success, we tend to judge it purely financially. So, there's often articles weighing up like, are you better off in Australia or New Zealand? What are the taxes like? What are the wages like? What are the house prices like? And you can read different articles and they'll come out either side, really. The first thing is it's just impossible to know what might have been. If you've moved to Australia and made your life there, you don't actually know what would have happened if you'd lived in New Zealand. And I was quite interested in this. I often asked interviewees, what do you think? Do you ever think about what might have been? And they'd say yes, and always their present was better than their New Zealand might have been. But you don't actually know. Interestingly, I interview people in their homes almost all the time, and so this is very unscientific, but when I looked around at people's homes, there was a real range, and I couldn't look at all their houses and say, it looks like everyone in Australia is living in a nicer suburb and a nicer house compared to New Zealand. Those who were successful in Australia, I think they would have probably been successful in New Zealand. They were usually educated professionals who'd done well, and they may have made more money in Australia, but I think they still would have been very comfortably off in New Zealand. Now, the one exception to this is the mining industry. I did talk to quite a few guys who'd been involved for many years on mining sites. They were fascinating interviews just because of the experiences, and they were all very sort of financially focused. And a lot of them, they weren't particularly skilled or educated, but they'd made a lot more money working in manual jobs than they would have in New Zealand. But at the same time, a lot of them had wasted a lot of money too, so they would be living in Kalgoorlie and go to Bali every year to escape the horrible life in Kalgoorlie. So the mining industry is a really interesting topic, and I'm actually writing an article at the moment on Western Australia's New Zealand's new sort of Western frontier. But it's a very bust and boom industry, so you do get people who make a lot of money, but then you get people who just can't get a job there. So that's the financial side, but of course success is really a lot more, I think, than just your bank balance and your house. So I would ask people, their reflections on moving, did they feel it had been successful, that it had been worthwhile? And interestingly, people who were still in Australia and also returned migrants to New Zealand, they were nearly all uniformly positive about their experience in Australia. Even those who'd chosen to return to New Zealand and live, they still felt it was a really great experience. I looked in my thesis a lot at how people constructed their stories, how they built them to make sense of their life, and naturally, I suppose, people emphasised that their decisions had been about growth, about learning, that they'd made correct choices. And it's interesting because often when you'd hear people's stories, they actually hadn't probably made very good choices, or they'd had very hard experiences, painful experiences. Maybe they'd been really homesick, found it very hard moving, and they did have regrets, but they didn't really emphasise this in their story. I'm just going to read a wee quote by a recent neuroscience study by someone called Tali Sharot, who argues that our brains are hardwired to place high value on our past and faith in our own decisions. She writes, "The affirmation of our decisions helps us derive heightened pleasure from choices that might actually be neutral. Without this, our lives might well be filled with second guessing. Have we done the right thing? Should we change our mind? We would find ourselves stuck, overcome by indecision." And I think this is really true. I mean, people, when they tell a life story, they want it to make sense and they want it to be meaningful to where they are now. And in terms of oral history, Alistair Thompson, who's a very well-known Australian oral historian, argues that there's a process called dual composure. So when people tell their story, they partly compose their story just based on the available cultural resources, but they also create coherent life stories which provide a personal sense of composure. They can feel composed about their life and the decisions they've made. So that question of, is it a success or not? Yes, they'd all say it was a success, but probably not objectively. It's just in terms of they have to convince themselves that it was a success. And that's good. I mean, that's mental health. You need that. So I'm just going to end this up with finishing the story about my sister and Ben. I'll tell you what happened to them because it was very interesting. So they moved over to Melbourne, and Ben went over to WA to look for a mining job, but just nothing came up. He couldn't find work, and he's got a very good energy management degree. He's worked for Doc a lot, so he's very, very outdoorsy. I mean, he's a southern man from Te Anau. So what ended up happening was that he worked in New Zealand doing contracts for Doc and would fly over periodically to see Michelle. So they ended up not really living together at all for a year. Michelle, she really liked her work, but it was pretty full on, and they couldn't really afford to live close to where she worked, so it was a long commute. On the bright side, I mean, they joined a church, they made some really good friends, which I was impressed. I mean, I think it's always good to join a group, join some kind of organisation to meet people. You can see the picture of there. Catherine, my other sister, and I, we went over for a girls' weekend and had a great time in Melbourne. Went to a Aussie Rules football game and had a really good time. And she had other visitors as well. But what happened was that after a year, Michelle and Ben decided, we actually don't want to do this. This is not sustainable, this lifestyle. And they formulated a plan that they were going to come back to New Zealand and start their own company, doing contracting for Doc. And so now they live down in Te Anau, and they have a company where they go and, I don't know that much about this, but they cut tracks and they do pest control and that kind of thing, just out in the middle of nowhere in amazing sort of New Zealand national parks. And they love it. They love it. Michelle doesn't work as a physio anymore. She cooks for the gang, she does the admin, and she loves it. And Ben there with their dog Penny, you can tell he loves it too. I couldn't get a photo of both of them. I tried to get Michelle, but they had no internet because they're in the middle of nowhere. So I just think that's interesting because you'd look at that from the outside and say that was a failed year. They didn't even spend it together. They ended up, Michelle didn't even use her physios. It was sort of a waste of professional development. They could have just got straight into there. But when you talk to them, they don't say that. They say, no, it was a really important year. We learned what we wanted. Our relationship grew stronger. We came through a hard time. And it set us up for doing what we really want to do. So I guess that would just be my ending point, is I don't mean this lecture to turn anyone off from moving to Australia. So many people I talked to had wonderful experiences, and I'm just trying to highlight things might be more difficult, and it's good to plan and to be aware of hiccups that might come along the way, but people are generally always positive about it. Yeah.